Hello there, the internet. My name's Broadzilla, and I will be bringing you Broadzilla's Bedtime Story Corner. As you can see, I'm already in my pajamas, and I don't know about you, but I am ready for my bedtime story. Now, the first book that we are going to be reading tonight is one of my very favorites. That's Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. And it's been written by Judy Barrett and drawn by Ron Barrett. I love the illustrations in this book. It's one of my favorites. So let me just get comfortable here, and we'll get started with the story. Alright, here we go. We were all sitting around the big kitchen table. It was Saturday morning, pancake morning. Mom was squeezing oranges for juice. Henry and I were betting how many pancakes we could eat, and Grandpa was doing the flipping. Seconds later, something flew through the air, headed towards the kitchen ceiling, and landed right on Henry. After we realized the flying object was only a pancake, we all laughed, even Grandpa. Breakfast continued quite uneventfully. All the other pancakes landed in the pan, and all of them were eaten, even the one that landed on Henry. That night, touched off by the pancake incident at breakfast, Grandpa told us the best tall-tale bedtime story he'd ever told. Across the ocean, over lots of huge bumpy mountains, across 3 hot deserts and 1 smaller ocean, there lay the tiny town of Chew and Swallow. In most ways, it was very much like any other tiny town. It had a main street lined with stores, houses with trees and gardens around them, a schoolhouse, about 300 people, some assorted cats and dogs. But there were no food stores in the town of Chew and Swallow. They didn't need any. The sky supplied all the food they could possibly want. The only thing that was really different about Chew and Swallow was its weather. It came 3 times a day, at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Everything that everyone ate came from the sky. Whatever the weather served, that was what they ate. But it never rained rain, it never snowed snow, and it never blew just wind. It rained things like soup and juice. It snowed mashed potatoes and green peas, and sometimes the wind blew in storms of hamburgers. Love the illustrations in this book. I wish I had a good way of showing them on the screen. The people could watch the weather report on television in the morning, and they would even hear a prediction for the next day's food. When the townspeople went outside, they carried their plates, cups, glasses, forks, spoons, knives, and napkins with them. That way they would always be prepared for any kind of weather. If there were leftovers, and there usually were, the people took them home to put in their refrigerators in case they got hungry between meals. The menu varied. By the time they woke up in the morning, breakfast was coming down. After a brief shower of orange juice, low clouds of sunny-side-up eggs moved in, followed by pieces of toast, jelly, butter sprinkled down for the toast, and most of the time it rained milk afterward. Boy, that would smell terrible, wouldn't it? For lunch one day, frankfurters, already in their rolls, blew in from the northwest at about 5 miles an hour. There were mustard clouds nearby, and then the wind shifted to the east and brought in baked beans. A drizzle of soda finished off the meal. Dinner one night consisted of lamb chops, becoming heavy at times, with occasional ketchup. Periods of peas and baked potatoes were followed by gradual clearing, with a wonderful jello setting in the west. The sanitation department of Chew and Swallow had a rather unusual job for a sanitation department. It had to remove food that fell on the houses and sidewalks and lawns. The workers cleaned up things after every meal and fed all the dogs and cats. And then they emptied some of it into the surrounding ocean for the fish and turtles and whales to eat. The rest of the food was put back into the earth so that the soil would be richer for people's flower gardens. Life for the townspeople was delicious until the weather took a turn for the worse. One day there was nothing but gorgonzola cheese all day long. The next day there was only broccoli, all overcooked. And the next day there were Brussels sprouts and peanut butter with mayonnaise. Another day there was a pea soup fog. No one could see where they were going, and they could barely find the rest of the meal that got stuck in the fog. The food was getting larger and larger, and so were the portions. The people were getting frightened. Violent storms blew up frequently. Awful things were happening. One Tuesday there was a hurricane of bread and rolls, all day long and into the night. There were soft rolls and hard rolls, some with seeds and some without. There was white bread and rye and whole wheat toast. Most of it was larger than they'd ever seen bread and rolls before. It was a terrible day. Everyone had to stay indoors. Roofs were damaged, and the sanitation department was beside itself. The mess took the workers 4 days to clean up, and the sea was full of floating rolls. To help out, people piled as much bread as they could in their backyards. The birds picked at it a bit, but it just stayed there and got staler and staler. There was a storm of pancakes one morning and a downpour of maple syrup that nearly flooded the town. A huge pancake covered the school. No one could get it off because of its weight, so they had to close the school. Lunch one day brought 15-inch drifts of cream cheese and jelly sandwiches. Everyone ate themselves sick, and the day ended with a stomachache. There was an awful salt and pepper wind accompanied by an even worse tomato tornado. People were sneezing themselves silly and running to avoid the tomatoes. The town was a mess. There were seeds and pulp everywhere. The sanitation department gave up. The job was too big. Everyone feared for their lives. They couldn't go outside most of the time. Many houses had been badly damaged by giant meatballs. Stores were boarded up, and there was no more school for the children. So a decision was made to abandon the town of Chew and Swallow. It was a matter of survival. The people glued together the giant pieces of stale bread and sandwich style with peanut butter, took the absolute necessities with them, and set sail on their rafts for a new land. After being afloat for a week, they finally reached a small coastal town, which welcomed them. The Bread had held up surprisingly well, well enough for them to build temporary houses for themselves out of it. The children began school again, and the adults all tried to find places for themselves in the new land. The biggest change they had to make was getting used to buying food at a supermarket. They found it odd that the food was kept on shelves, packaged in boxes, cans, and bottles. Meat that had to be cooked was kept in large refrigerators. Nothing came down from the sky except rain and snow. The clouds above their heads were not made of fried eggs, and no one ever got hit with a hamburger again. And nobody dared go back to Chew and Swallow to find out what had happened to it. They were too afraid. Henry and I were awake until the end of Grandpa's story. I remember his goodnight kiss. The next morning we woke up to see snow falling outside our window. We ran downstairs for breakfast and ate it a little faster than usual so we could go sledding with Grandpa. It's funny, but even as we were sliding down the hill, we thought we saw a giant pat of butter at the top, and we could almost smell mashed potatoes. The end. And that was Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. Once again, one of my very favorite books when I was a kid. But we are not done. There's more. Next up, we are going to start on The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis. It is the first in the Chronicles of Narnia series, if you're not familiar. And if you're not familiar, lucky you, we're going to be reading it. Though probably not all at once. I'm going to be reading a chapter or two every night, and but I don't think that I want to read them all in order. So the next one after Magician's Nephew is Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which I want to get to, and we will get to, but we are probably going to take a break between. That way nobody gets burnt out on C.S. Lewis. All right. So, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the most famous of the books, but the very first one in the series is, as I mentioned, Magician's Nephew. So that's where we're going to start. All right. Give me just a sec here. Here we go. Chapter 1, The Wrong Door. This is a story about something that happened long ago when your grandfather was a child. It is a very important story because it shows how all the comings and goings between our own world and the land of Narnia first began. In those days, Mr. Sherlock Holmes was living in Baker Street, and the Bastables were looking for treasure in Lewisham Road. In those days, if you were a boy, you had to wear a stiff Eton collar every day, and schools were usually nastier than now. But meals were nicer, and as for sweets, I won't tell you how cheap and good they were, because it would only make your mouth water in vain. And in those days, there lived in London a girl named Polly Plummer. She lived in one of a long row of houses which were all joined together. One morning, she was out in the back garden when a boy scrambled from the garden next door and put his face over the wall. Polly was very surprised, because up until now there'd never been any children in that house, but only Mr. Ketterley and Miss Ketterley, a brother and sister, old bachelor and old maid, living together. So she looked up, full of curiosity. The face of the strange boy was very grubby. It could hardly have been grubbier if he had first rubbed his hands in the earth and then had a good cry, and then dried his face with his hands. As a matter of fact, this was very nearly what he had been doing. "Hullo," said Polly. "Hullo," said the boy. "What's your name?" Polly, said Polly. What's yours? Diggory, said the boy. I say, what a funny name, said Polly. It isn't half so funny as Polly, said Diggory. Yes, it is, said Polly. No, it isn't, said Diggory. At any rate, I do wash my face, said Polly, which is what you need to do, especially after... And then she stopped. She'd been going to say, after you've been blubbering, but she thought that wouldn't be polite. All right, I have, then, said Diggory in a much louder voice, like a boy who was so miserable that he didn't care who knew he'd been crying. And so would you, he went on, if you'd lived all your life in the country and had a pony and a river at the bottom of the garden, and then been brought to live in a beastly hole like this. London isn't a hole, said Polly indignantly, but the boy was too wound up to take any notice of her, and he went on, and if your father was away in India, and if you had to come and live with an aunt and uncle who's mad, who would like that? And if the reason was that they were looking after your mother, and if your mother was ill and going to die, and then his face went the wrong sort of shape, as it does when you're trying to keep back your tears. I didn't know. I'm sorry, said Polly humbly, and then, because she hardly knew what to say, also to turn Diggory's mind to cheerful subjects, she asked, Is Mr. Ketterley really mad? Well, either he's mad, said Diggory, or there's some other mystery. He has a study at the top floor, and Aunt Letty says I must never go up there. Well, that looks fishy to begin with, and then there's another thing. Whenever he tries to say anything to me at mealtimes, he never even tries to talk to her. She always shuts him up. She says, Don't worry the boy, Andrew, or I'm sure Diggory doesn't want to hear about that. Or else, now, Diggory, wouldn't you like to go out and play in the garden? What sort of things does he try to say? I don't know. He never gets far enough. But there's more than that. One night, it was last night in fact, as I was going past the foot of the attic stairs on my way to bed, and I don't much care for going past them either, I'm sure I heard a yell. Perhaps he keeps a mad wife shut up there. Yes, I've thought of that. Or perhaps he's a coiner. Or he might have been a pirate, like the man at the beginning of Treasure Island, and he's always hiding from his old shipmates. How exciting, said Polly. I never knew your house was so interesting. You may think it interesting, said Diggory, but you wouldn't like it if you had to sleep there. How would you like to lie awake listening for Uncle Andrew's step to come creeping along the passage to your room? And he has such awful eyes. That was how Polly and Diggory got to know one another. And as it was just the beginning of the summer and holidays, and neither of them was going to the sea that year, they met nearly every day. Their adventures began chiefly because it was one of the wettest and coldest summers that there had been for years. That drove them to do indoor things, you might say indoor exploration. It is wonderful how much exploring you can do with a stump of candle in a big house, or in a row of houses. Polly had discovered long ago that if you opened a certain little door in the box room attic of her house, you would find the cistern and a dark place behind it which you could go into by a little careful climbing. The dark place was a long tunnel with brick wall on one side and a sloping roof on the other. In the roof there were little chunks of light between the slates. There was no floor in this tunnel. You had to step from rafter to rafter, and between them there was only plaster. If you stepped on this, you would find yourself falling through the ceiling of the room below. Polly had used the bit of tunnel just beside the cistern as a smuggler's cave. She had brought up bits of old packing cases and the seats of broken kitchen chairs and things of that sort, and spread them across from rafter to rafter, so as to make a bit of floor. Here she kept a cash box containing various treasures, and a story she was writing, and usually a few apples. She had often drunk quite a lot of ginger beer in there. The old bottles made it look more like a smuggler's cave. One sec. Diggory quite liked the cave. She wouldn't let him see the story, but he was more interested in exploring. "Look here," he said. "How long does this tunnel go on for? I mean, does it stop where your house ends?" "No," said Polly. "The walls don't go out to the roof. It goes on. I don't know how far." "Then we should get the length of the whole row of houses." "So we could," said Polly. "And, oh, I say." "What?" "We could get into other houses." "Yes, and get taken up for burglars. No thanks." "Don't be so jolly clever. I was thinking of the house beyond yours." "What about it?" "Why, it's the empty one. Daddy says it's always been empty since we came here." "I suppose we ought to have a look at it then," said Diggory. He was a good deal more excited than you'd have thought from the way he spoke. For of course he was thinking, just as you would have been, of all the reasons why the house might have been empty so long. So was Polly. Neither of them said the word haunted, and both felt that once the thing had been suggested, it would be feeble not to do it. "Shall we go and try it now?" said Diggory. "All right," said Polly. "Don't if you'd rather not," said Diggory. "I'm game if you are," she said. "How are we to know we're in the next house, but, we're in the How are we to know we're in the next house but one?" They decided they would have to go out into the box room and walk across it, taking steps as long as the steps from one rafter to the next. That would give them an idea of how many rafters went to a room. Then they would allow about 4 more for the passage between the 2 attics in Polly's house, and then the same number for the maid's bedroom as for the box room. That would give them the length of the house. When they had done that distance twice, they would be at the end of Diggory's house. Any door they came after that would surely let them into the attic of the empty house. "But I don't expect it's really empty at all," said Diggory. "What do you expect?" "I expect somebody lives there in secret, only coming in and out at night with a dark lantern. We shall probably discover a gang of desperate criminals and get a reward. It was all rot to say a house would be empty all those years unless there was some mystery." "Daddy thought it must be the drains," said Polly. "Pooh! Grown-ups are always thinking of uninteresting explanations," said Diggory. Now that he was talking by daylight in the attic instead of by candlelight in the smuggler's cave, it seemed much less likely that the empty house would be haunted. When they had measured the attic, they had to get a pencil and do a sum. They both got different answers to do it at first, and even when they had agreed, I'm not sure they got it right. They were in a hurry to start on the exploration. "We mustn't make a sound," said Polly as they climbed in again behind the cistern. Because it was such an important occasion, they took a candle each. Polly had a good store of them in her cave. It was very dark and dusty and draughty, and as they stepped from rafter to rafter, without a word, except when they whispered to one another, "We're opposite your attic now," or "This must be halfway through our house." And neither of them stumbled, and the candles didn't go out. And at last they came to where they could see a little door in the brick wall on their right. There was no bolt or handle on this side of it, of course, for the door had been made for getting in, not for getting out. But there was a catch, as there often is on the inside of a cupboard door, which they felt sure they would be able to turn. "Shall I?" said Diggory. "I'm game if you are," said Polly, just as she had said before. Both felt that it was becoming very serious, but neither would draw back. Diggory pushed round the catch with some difficulty. The door swung open, and the sudden daylight made them blink. Then, with a great shock, They saw that they were looking not into a deserted attic, but into a furnished room. It seemed empty enough. It was dead silent. Polly's curiosity got the better of her. She blew out her candle and stepped out into the strange room, making no more noise than a mouse. It was shaped, of course, like an attic, but furnished as a sitting room. Every bit of the walls was lined with shelves, and every bit of the shelves was full of books. A fire was burning in the grate. You remember that it was very cold, wet summer that year. And in the front of the fireplace, with its back toward them, was a high-backed armchair. Between the chair and Polly, and filling most of the middle of the room, was a big table piled with all sorts of things. Printed books, and books of the sort you write in, and ink bottles and pens and sealing wax and a microscope. But what she noticed first was a bright red wooden tray with a number of rings on it. They were in pairs, a yellow one and a green one together, and then a little space, and then another yellow one and another green one. They were no bigger than ordinary rings, and no one could help noticing them because they were so bright. They were the most beautiful, shiny little things you can imagine. If Polly had been a very little younger, she would have wanted to put one in her mouth. The room was so quiet that you noticed the ticking of the clock at once, and yet, as she now found, it was not absolutely quiet either. There was a very faint humming sound. If hoovers had been invented in those days, Polly would have thought it was the sound of a hoover being worked a long way off, several rooms away and several floors below. But it was a nicer sound than that, a more musical tone, only so faint that you could hardly hear it. "It's all right, there's no one here," said Polly over her shoulder to Diggory. She was speaking above a whisper now, and Diggory came out, blinking and looking extremely dirty, as indeed Polly was too. "This is no good," he said. "It's not an empty house after all. We'd better bunk before anybody comes." "What do you think those are?" said Polly, pointing at the colored rings. "Oh, come on," said Diggory. The sooner he never finished what he was going to say, for at that moment something happened. The high-backed chair in front of the fire moved, and suddenly there rose up out of it, like a pantomime demon coming out of a trap door, the alarming form of Uncle Andrew. They were not in the empty house at all. They were in Diggory's house, and in the forbidden study. Both children said, "Oh!" and realized their terrible mistake. They felt they ought to have known all along that they hadn't gone nearly far enough. Uncle Andrew was tall and very thin. He had long, clean-shaven face, with a sharply pointed nose and extremely bright eyes, and great tousled mop of gray hair. Diggory was quite speechless, for Uncle Andrew looked 1,000 times more alarming than he had ever looked before. Polly was not so frightened yet, but she soon was, for the very first thing Uncle Andrew did was to walk across the door to the door of the room, shut it, and turn the key in the lock, and then he turned around, fixed the children with his bright eyes, and smiled, showing all his teeth. "There," he said, "now my fool the sister can't get at you." It was dreadfully unlike anything a grown-up would be expected to do. Polly's heart came into her mouth, and she and Diggory started backing towards the little door they had come in by. Uncle Andrew was too quick for them. He got behind them and shut that door too, and stood in front of it. Then he rubbed his hands and made his knuckles crack. He had very long, beautiful white fingers. "I am delighted to see you," he said. "2 children are just what I wanted." "Oh." "Please, Mr. Ketterly," said Polly, "it's nearly my dinner time, and I've got to go home. Will you let us go out, please?" "Not just yet," said Uncle Andrew. "It's too good an opportunity to miss. I wanted 2 children. You see, I'm in the middle of a great experiment. I've tried it on a guinea pig, and it seemed to work, but then a guinea pig can't tell you anything, and you can't explain to it how to come back. "Look here, Uncle Andrew," said Diggory. "It really is dinner time, and they'll be looking for us in a moment. You must let us out." "Must?" said Uncle Andrew. Diggory and Polly glanced at one another. They dared not say anything, but the glances meant, "Isn't this dreadful?" and "We must humor him." "If you let us go for our dinner now," said Polly, "we could come back after dinner." "Ah, but how do I know that you would?" said Uncle Andrew, with a cunning smile. Then he seemed to change his mind. One sec. "Well, well," he said, "if you really must go, I suppose you must. I can't expect two youngsters like you to find it much fun talking to an old buffer like me." He sighed and went on. "You've no idea how lonely I sometimes am. But no matter. Go to your dinner. But I must give you a present before you go. It's not every day that I see a little girl in my dingy old study. Especially, if I must say so, such a very attractive young lady as yourself." Polly began to think he might not really be mad after all. "Wouldn't you like a ring, my dear?" said Uncle Andrew to Polly. "Do you mean one of those yellow or green ones?" said Polly. "How lovely!" "Not a green one," said Uncle Andrew. "I'm afraid I can't give the green ones away, but I'd be delighted to give you any of the yellow ones. With my love. Come and try one on." Polly had now quite got over her fright, and felt sure that the old gentleman was not mad, and there was certainly something strangely attractive about those bright rings. She moved over to the tray. "Why, I declare," she said, "that humming noise gets louder here. It's almost as if the rings were making it." "What a funny fancy, my dear," said Uncle Andrew with a laugh. It sounded a very natural laugh, but Diggory had seen an eager, almost greedy look on his face. "Polly, don't be a fool," he shouted. "Don't touch them." It was too late. Exactly as he spoke, Polly's hand went out to touch one of the rings, and immediately, without a flash or a noise or a warning of any sort, there was no Polly. Diggory and his uncle were alone in the room. And that is the end of the first chapter. And as this is my first episode doing this, my voice is a little tired. So I'm going to leave it there. And I will pick this back up on Wednesday, I think. I planned on doing this on Mondays and Wednesdays and Thursdays. I might be able to do it more later, but I figured that was a good place to start. So yeah, we'll pick this back up on Wednesday. I'll pick up where I left off. There'll be another picture book beforehand. And yeah, good night, everybody.